Migrating to Azure SQL with Mohamed Kabiruddin.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything the dotnet ecosystem has to offer. This podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers dotnet teams to be self-sufficient, able to deliver world-class results. They are hiring architects and dotnet engineers who'd like a path to become an architect. So you can go to clearmeasure.com/careers for that. And finally, be sure to check out the new video shows coming online. Our guest today is Mohamed Kabiruddin, and he is a senior program manager in the Azure SQL Product Team and is currently located in Redmond, Washington. But prior to joining the product team, he was a cloud solution architect working with enterprise customers in Australia on all things Azure Data and AI. He's very passionate about the data community and loves to be a part of events that provide an opportunity to interact with like-minded data folks. Mohamed, how are you, sir? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm great. Glad to have you on. You've done so much speaking around this, but I bet you there's a listener or two out there who hasn't seen you speaking and hasn't been able to kind of share in what you're doing. Before we kind of get into Azure SQL and everything that's new and migrating there, how to plan for that, just to get to know you a little bit better. What are the high points that have kind of led you up to what you're doing now for Microsoft in your career?
Yeah, fantastic question. So I, as you've described in my intro, I lived in Australia most of my professional life, and I've done consulting in business intelligence, data warehousing, SQL Server. And it was just a natural transition to work for the data team in Microsoft, because all my life I've only been doing that. And so I recently moved to the US last year, and it was a great opportunity to work with the SQL product team, so I couldn't resist that. And ever since, I've been super focused and excited on working on things that are Azure SQL related. So, as part of my life, I think it's embedded somewhere along the lines that I would be a part of SQL all my life.
Yeah.
And then no better place to work than being a part of the SQL team.
Well, it's interesting about data in general when people kind of pick something to focus on is applications that we write operate on data, but applications tend to be majorly renovated or rewritten. But the data that we're working on, sometimes it goes back decades and we just kind of import it,
Yeah,
So.
Absolutely. And it exists in all forms, right? Like if you look at the evolution of data today, from transactional to analytics to data lakes to lake houses, everything just revolves around data that you've accumulated over time. And SQL is a fundamental part of it that people sometimes miss to understand, because no matter what you do with even analytics, unless you write good SQL and work on databases, it's difficult to kind of join data sets and present it the way you want it with businesses. Or present or surface it in applications. Like you have structured and unstructured all over the place, but when it comes to applications, you need some sort of a structure that you can present it to your users, right? I think that's key.
Can you help us demystify this whole bit of Azure SQL and Azure Data? And you throw out some key terms, data lakes and whatnot, because you're helping customers migrate to Azure SQL, but then there's all these other data-related services.
Yes.
So how should people bucket or categorize those things in their mind when they're comparing what they have to how they should divvy it up in an Azure migration?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, if you go back in time a few years ago, you would possibly run SQL Server on a box, on a machine, on premises, You would have all the bells and whistles that come along with it, whether it's your database engine, you've got your BI components, you've got ETL, you've got your agent jobs running automated tasks overnight. So the whole lot was pretty much running on a server, and you'd have a DBA or a couple of DBAs in a team managing that whole environment. As you move to the cloud, it's and as you transition into the cloud, if you're looking at just lifting and shifting or replicating the same environment, you would again run the same thing on the cloud in a box, in a virtual machine. Well, as much as that is a good option to get to the cloud, that's not always the most efficient way to do things on the cloud, because when you talk about elasticity, the less overheads in management, you eventually need to move to a platform as a service-based model where things are automatically managed for you, and you focus on the things that you need to focus on. So with that in mind, you then try to dissect the whole ecosystem and put them into different buckets. So if you've got database, you have a service purely for databases like Azure SQL, run just your database on it. Leave the management of the operating system, leave the management of anything outside of your database to Microsoft or to another cloud provider, right? Same thing with BI. Like if you want to run ETL, you would either move your SSIS packages to something like Data Factory, which is again self-managed, and you just focus on the core business logic that does the job. If you want reporting, you move to Power BI. And so the whole concept of dissecting that central one box that you had running everything into multiple services that are self-managed is key to getting the maximum benefits out of the cloud. Right?
Okay.
And migrating to that it takes a lot to understand how these things fit together in the ecosystem. There's a lot of integration points. There's a lot of connectors. And I think Microsoft and Azure have done a fantastic job in making sure these components fit well together within the data ecosystem. Like all the stuff that we do today, whether it's Azure SQL or Synapse, you will see connectors floating around everywhere, so that you don't have to do the plumbing that you previously used to do on premises. You just leverage native connectors that we deliver, and you make that ecosystem work.
Okay.
Right? Whether it's connectivity into .NET applications, drivers, running app services on Azure with SQL databases, all that's figured out for you. You just have to configure the dials and get going.
You had mentioned a lot of customers, of course, have very large SQL Server cluster installations that they've had for a long time, and they're moving. You're helping them migrate. So if everything was inside SQL Server and they had some transactional schemas and maybe they had some OLAP schemas and whatnot, when they're going to Azure, obviously they could migrate it exactly where it is into Azure SQL and use this SQL as a service. But what types of schema should they say, oh wait, no, let me look at Data Lake, or let me look at Synapse. Let me not use Azure SQL, the managed instance, or the serverless, but let me use one of the other ones. What should they key off of?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one that we've published a lot of guidance on in the past as well. Like there's a lot of schema types and there's a lot of data types that are out there, where now that you're moving to the cloud and you want to make it more efficient for your operations, you can actually think about leveraging these different services. For example, if you have pure OLTP transactional databases that your applications communicate with, it's a no-brainer. It has to be a transactional database, whether it's Azure SQL, Postgres, MySQL, some sort of transactional database. And then you have, on the flip side, you have the data warehousing workload or the data mart type of workload, which is pretty much highly aggregated, compressed data sets. You need the benefits of multi-processing components to make sure that it's distributed to do that level of aggregations and computations that it requires. And obviously, SQL DW, which has now evolved into being Synapse, is a great platform for that. And you also have a mix of services which can do some of a bit of both. Like for example, if you take the Azure SQL Hyperscale particularly, and I'm sure guests from the team have spoken to you about Hyperscale in the past, there's a nice sweet spot where you can run HTAP workloads, which is basically both your transactional and analytical workloads on a SQL transactional database because of the architecture that it delivers.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have ETL, you have analysis services or tabular formats, which also has equivalent services in Azure with Azure Analysis Services. So instead of running that on a SQL Server machine, you would take it to Azure Analysis Services or Power BI, depending on your needs, and move it to that. So I guess the key is, understanding what is your data type, how these map to the cloud services, and how these actually scale on the cloud, because that's another important factor you need to consider. Like if your data volumes are growing tremendously, you need to figure out how you're going to scale that. And one of the benefits of moving to the cloud is getting that elasticity, right? So you need to ensure you fit the right target types. And we call this as your target destinations when you move to the cloud. And we've published a lot of guidance. So if you go to aka.ms/data migration, you can see a lot of guides around how to migrate your data from on-premises or different databases to Azure.
Awesome. You had mentioned the renaming of Azure Synapse, and I think there's a lot of people I've encountered that saw the announcements of Azure Synapse, thought, "Oh, this is a new thing, a net new thing." But touch on that a little more. What is it? Is it a completely just rebranding, or have there been a lot of things added? Kind of unpack that for us.
Since I don't work in the Synapse team, I probably wouldn't do justice in explaining this, but I would still give it a shot anyway. I think the vision Azure Data team had for Synapse was to combine the benefits of data warehousing with big data analytics, right? These two were completely different worlds. On one side, you had data warehousing, which was purely, like I said, the highly aggregated data sets where you had to do a lot of ETL to get the business logic running and computations to get the reports out for business intelligence. And on the other hand, you had a whole bunch of data scientists leveraging platforms like Spark and Python and R to run, to train their machine learning models or to write machine learning models and produce insights that were not, really based on structured data sets. And often in my consulting time with data professionals, I've seen a clear separation of duties between these two. If I actually walk into an organization, there'll be a floor full of data warehousing guys or girls, and then there'll be another floor with data scientists in their own little block, right? And very often you would find these two teams or these two businesses don't communicate much because each one believes in their own scope of work, right, that they have to deliver, while the data science team is focused on delivering business value to their executives or to the business folks. Mm-hmm. The data warehousing guys are focused on getting the data quality right and getting the right ETL mapped out to produce accurate data sets for BI and those kind of things. And there's often a very little commonality of collaboration and platforms between these two. So to bring that together, because there's a lot of cross-pollination that can happen between these two teams for the benefit of the organization or the business. And I think that's where Microsoft Azure Data Team thought of this vision that, hey, why not deliver a single platform that can bring together both of these personas into a single platform where you bring your data in the best quality that's possible and have the consumers like data scientists consume from the same spot. And hence Synapse was born, and you can see that playing out in the market today.
Okay, awesome. And before the show was on, you were mentioning of all the huge investments that Microsoft is making in the data space in Azure. I know the .NET Conf was just recently, and then the Ignite conference, last fall. Yep. But what should the average .NET developer really pay attention to of all these investments that are happening?
Yeah, I guess some of the biggest investments we make within, I'll speak to SQL platform, right? When it comes to the way we look at evolving Azure SQL platform in the cloud, is talking about getting the most resilient platform out to the developers so that they only deal with code that they have to write within the applications and leave the entire data management stuff to the data platform. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about backups, disaster recovery, high availability, redundancy, storage replicas or compute replicas, all of that is taken care of by the Azure SQL platform. So, if you're a .NET developer, all you need to focus on is writing good code that can talk to the platform, and the rest is left with the hands of the data folks, right? And it's managed, it's self-managed, it's redundant for your needs in terms of meeting your HA requirements. If you need backups that need to be retained for a long term, they are out there. If you need low latency, there are options. If you need high throughput, there are options. So all that is taken care of for you, right? And if you need queries that are constantly run, that need to be warmed up and cached, versus queries that are, that require high computation that need to scale, all that is automatically taken care of, between hyperscale to serverless to elastic pools to single database to managed instance to virtual machines. I think there's a wide variety of choices to meet every single need that a developer needs within their application. So I'd suggest, getting an understanding of what offerings are there within the database world, leveraging the right option, because it matters on what option you choose. Like, for example, if you have an intermittent usage type application where, we've had customers who say, hey, I want to use this application gets used by our users only maybe once a week, right? But I don't want to pay for 24/7 on the cloud because it only gets used once a week. Right. For such models, serverless is a great fit because you only pay for what you use. And the times you're not using it, it's paused and you're not getting charged for it. Similarly, we've got customers where say, hey, I've got like hundreds of databases, but they're so tiny that I want to be able to share resources across all those databases and pay for very minimal compute. Elastic pools for that is a great choice, right? And then you've got customers who come and tell us, hey, I've got some really old school legacy SQL Server databases. I don't think I'm ready to fully modernize to something like elastic pools or serverless yet, because I've got things like link servers, I've got distributed transactions from my application, and I need to be able to support that. Then your best bet is to go to managed instance, which gives you an on-prem like capabilities, but still gives you the goodness of the cloud. So I guess as a developer, it's important for you to understand all these choices, select the right target, and focus on applications that you build, and the rest is taken care of.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
So for let's say even greenfield applications, new applications, and they're using the latest of .NET 6, and they're using the latest in the Entity Framework for object relational mapping, and they have a relational database for some transactional data. They might scale high in the future, but for this next year, okay, it's not immediate scale. It just needs to work, and this needs to be online. What's that rule of thumb? What flavor of Azure SQL should they probably look at first, just to get started?
By default, I think the most popular option that our customers leverage for SQL database, like greenfield cloud-born native applications, is Azure SQL DB, right? Which is a single database offering, because all you need to care about with that is provision a single database, as the name sounds. You don't need to worry about any other management besides putting your data on that database, right? So I guess the rule of thumb there is choose the default Azure SQL database, launch, write your code and make sure it's compatible with your code and it performs as expected. You can always scale up as your demand grows, as your data volumes grow, but it becomes also an easy choice to move off from SQL DB to another choice if you feel the need for it. Like, for example, if you feel like, okay, it's running fine on SQL DB, but looks like my application's usage pattern is very intermittent. After the launch in the market, I've realized that users only use this on a Sunday when they're watching sports tournaments, for example, if it's a sports-related betting application or something. Yeah. Then you could switch on to something like serverless, and you could easily transition from one type of a SQL offering to another, right? In some cases, when you move from one to another, there is a migration path involved, but in most cases, it's seamless. What we call as an SLO update, which is basically an update of a SKU from one SKU to another.
So on the serverless, you could go from very low traffic during the week and then a high spike on the weekend.
Correct.
Without having to do anything. No commands, no going into the Azure portal. It just handles it.
Correct. That's right.
Nice.
And then you have the auto pause and resume functionality too. So when you don't have any users, when there's no traffic at all, it'll wait for a period of time and then it'll pause. At which point you don't have you're not charging for any compute. Your database is completely in a pause state. All that is available is your data stored in the storage location. And when traffic starts coming back on, we auto resume that database, pull that storage back out, bring the data online, and deliver it to you.
Is that a situation where the team needs to think about loading that data up, or is it? I mean, how long does this auto resume take?
So, I mean, typically the auto resume functionality is a few seconds, right? And auto pause is we have an idle time period that you can configure. So you could say, hey, wait for 1 hour of inactivity. And if you don't find any activity for that 1 hour, shut it down, right? Basically pause it. And auto resume is as soon as a connection comes through, the process starts invoking it in the background. A few seconds later, you should have the database ready.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have the scenario where in the middle of the night, they have very, very low, if no usage for, say, internal applications at their business, where the users of the application are their own employees. And or I don't know, localized point of sale systems where, hey, the store is closed at night,
Yeah.
And so at least 4 hours, even if people work till midnight and then get there at 6 a.m. I mean, you could at least turn off for 4 hours, which is once, and then that reduces your bill by 1/6.
Right.
Because that's in the middle of the night.
And typically we used to do this on premises too, like back in my consulting days, right? Mm-hmm. When I used to do consulting for BI solutions, it was always a case where, hey, ETL starts at 3 a.m. in the morning and it finishes at 6 a.m. My data is ready, but then the users start coming in at 9 a.m. So, what should we do to make sure that data is warm enough to surface to users and it's performant enough? And there was this common concept of warming up the queries just before business starts, right? I remember, we used to write queries at 8 a.m. They go and run off, in parallel across the board, warm up and cache all the queries that the users need. And by 9 a.m. when the users come in, it's almost like business as usual. Nothing happened overnight and they're ready to consume that data.
Well, on the flip side, you've also got the scenarios where maybe in the middle of the night, you want to quadruple your processing capacity because whether we like it or not, there's plenty of integrations that still happen by these big old data files being dropped in a SFTP share, and then they have to be sucked into a data source.
Correct.
And so you get those once a day, whether you like it or not, whether you wish it was messaging that just kind of streamed constantly, they're still very common.
That's right.
So maybe you need to crank it up in the middle of the night.
And you actually have touched on a very interesting point too. And speaking of migrations, right? In my experience with all the migration tools and services and customers I've worked with, migrations also demand something like that, where while you're migrating a database from anywhere to anywhere, right? You need to have your databases powered up because at that point, you're bringing in a lot more data while you're migrating it. There's a lot more throughput that's required to make sure your migrations happen as fast as you want it to. Because you can migrate for days or you can migrate it within hours or seconds. It depends on how much computational power and throughput you provide to it. So migrations are exactly the same, where you need to ramp up your compute, ramp up your throughput to make sure you're migrating it overnight within the shortest time window that's possible, or within a weekend that fits your business needs.
Mm-hmm.
So the exact same concept applies. So typically, let's say you were migrating to a SQL database, you could start off with a very small database, but then during the night when migration activity happens, bump it up. And in the morning, once your migration is complete, bump it back down.
Okay. Now, tell us about the latest in the very long in the tooth SQLServer Management Studio. It's been around for a long time, and now there's this Azure Data Studio, and of course you got Power BI that can also access all the data sources. What's the different categories of these data clients?
Well, I think within the data tools, both SSMS and Azure Data Studio are one of the most popular tools that are out there within the data professionals and developers, right? Obviously, Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code is ranked higher with developers, but for data professionals, I think SSMS and ADS lead the way in terms of management and operation of data services. SSMS obviously has been around for a very long time. I think it's the popularity and market share is still the highest, but we are seeing tremendous growth in Azure Data Studio, primarily because it's cross OS compatible. It can run on Windows, Linux, Mac, and the investments that we as Microsoft are making into building extensions within Azure Data Studio are, if you look at where we've come in the last 2 years, you've got so many extensions out there. You think of a scenario that you need to do within Azure Data Studio, you pretty much would have an extension available today, right?
Now it's the same shell as VS Code, is it?
It is.
Not,
it
or
is
slightly different.
exactly.
Version?
It is based on the same shell as VS Code, which is why you would see some of the extensions that we deliver in Azure Data Studio would also be available in Visual Studio Code and vice versa. Although, unless it's launched officially, some capabilities might not be supported, but it's exactly the same concept. It's very lightweight. Like it takes nothing to start up Azure Data Studio. I know SSMS can get heavier at times to start up, but Azure Data Studio is pretty instant, and I think we're seeing a good amount of traction with users both on Mac and Linux as well. Windows still is highest, but you see a lot of Mac users using Data Studio today, which they couldn't with SSMS previously.
Yeah, right. And if it's the same as VS Code, then that means it's written in TypeScript as well, which is just translated to JavaScript and then runs wherever JavaScript can run.
Correct. Where really Azure Data Studio shines is with this new personas of developers, database professionals, or data professionals starting to mix and match the way they query and manage databases. Like typically in SSMS, you would write a T-SQL query to query your databases. Where with Azure Data Studio, you can query it using T-SQL. You can write a notebook with Python, with PowerShell, right? And all of those cross-compatible features really shine with the new world of evolving data professionals. So a data scientist could use it to write a machine learning notebook in Python and use the same interface to query databases too. And I think that's where it really shines as a platform. And certainly we're seeing a lot of that happening.
Okay. So is it really aimed at people who are using one of the flavors of SQL Server, or is it a replacement also for blobs and queues and all? Is it all being grouped together, or is there some segmentation?
No. So when we started the first set of items that we delivered were obviously related to SQL, because we wanted to make sure the data DBAs can kind of use the tool. So the SQL management extensions, the admin packs, and running SQL agent jobs, all of that came to Azure Data Studio. But over time, you would have noticed now we have extensions for pretty much all flavors of Azure. You have extensions for Postgres. We're building out extensions for Oracle databases as well. You can even access data lakes. You can provision Azure resources. There's a lot happening in that space. I think the way we see it being invested is pretty much a client tool for managing data services. We don't want to differentiate between SQL or any other platform. So it is going to be a tool to manage all your Azure data services, and that's how we envision that the product to shape up. And there are extensions reflecting on it today.
I guess that's why it's called Azure Data Studio and doesn't have specifically SQL Server in there.
Yeah, okay. Everything is an extension. And again, that's one of the beauty. My favorite parts of it. Like with SSMS, you get it all in. There's no excluding what you don't want. Whereas with Azure Data Studio, you personalize it just to do your day job, right? Like if you're a DBA running SQL jobs, you install the SQL agent extension and you use that. If you're a data science person, you have the notebooks, run the kernels with whatever programming language you need, and that's what you use it for. So it's highly personalized, and it gives you that sense of, this is my tool, it's personalized the way I want it to work.
Nice. Awesome. Well, we've covered a lot of information on the data side and Azure SQL and migrating there. Are there any for the listeners who want to kind of dig in immediately and we pique their interest? Is there any resources that we should point them to right away?
Well, I wanted to mention, obviously, we have published a lot of articles and documentation to help customers migrate to Azure. If you go to aka.ms/data migration, you'll find a whole bunch of articles for any database platform to come into Azure, and we give you prescriptive guidance on it. We are also, like you mentioned, you brought up the topic of Azure Data Studio. We are heavily investing in building out extensions to help you migrate your databases to Azure using Azure Data Studio. So the intent there being, if you're using Azure Data Studio to manage your databases, you should be able to use the same tool to migrate your databases as well. So we've recently announced extensions like Azure SQL Migration Extension. There's an Oracle database schema conversion toolkit. So a lot of these investments that we're making is to make sure that you as a data professional or a developer can use the same platform that you manage databases with to also migrate without having to leave that interface. So I'd definitely recommend checking that out. And obviously, there's a ton of documentation we publish to get you started on this.
Awesome. Well, Mohamed, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing, talking with us about migrating to Azure SQL. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, might as well. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.